The year is 1945. The world stands at a crossroads, emerging from the shadows of a devastating global conflict. World War II, a conflict of unimaginable destruction, has finally ended. Nations across the globe breathe a collective sigh of relief, celebrating the hard-won peace. Victorious but weary, the Allied powers, the United States, Great Britain and the Soviet Union, face the daunting task of rebuilding a shattered world. The Yalta Conference marked the beginning of these efforts as leaders gathered to shape the post-war order. Yet, even as the rubble was cleared and cities began to rise from the ashes, the seeds of a new conflict were being sown. The world was on the brink of another, albeit different, kind of war. This conflict, known as the Cold War, would come to define the latter half of the 20th century. Unlike the hot wars of the past, this was a war of ideologies, fought through proxy battles, espionage, and political maneuvering. At the heart of this new struggle lay a fundamental difference in ideology and worldview. The clash between capitalism and communism would shape international relations for decades to come. The United States, with its capitalist economy and democratic principles, championed individual liberty and free markets. It presented itself as the defender of freedom and democracy, a beacon of hope in a world recovering from tyranny. The Soviet Union, under the iron grip of Joseph Stalin, promoted a communist system that emphasized state control and the suppression of individual freedoms. It sought to spread its ideology as a means of securing its own power and influence. These two superpowers, once allies against a common enemy, now eyed each other with suspicion and distrust. The wartime camaraderie had dissolved, replaced by a deep-seated rivalry. Europe, devastated by war, became the primary battleground for this ideological struggle. The continent was divided, with Western Europe aligning with the United States and Eastern Europe falling under Soviet influence. The Soviet Union, seeking to expand its sphere of influence, installed communist regimes in Eastern European nations it had occupied during the war. This expansion was seen as a direct threat by the Western powers. The United States, fearing the spread of communism, responded with policies designed to contain Soviet expansion. The Marshall Plan was one such effort, providing economic aid to help rebuild Western European economies and prevent the spread of communist ideology. This clash of interests set the stage for a prolonged period of geopolitical tension, mistrust and rivalry that came to be known as the Cold War. It was a time of espionage, nuclear arms races and proxy wars, with the world constantly on edge, fearing the outbreak of a full-scale conflict. The Cold War was a unique conflict unlike any other in history. Unlike the world wars that preceded it, which were characterized by massive battles and widespread destruction, this was not a war fought on traditional battlefields with armies clashing head-on. Instead, it was a war of nerves, strategy, and influence. Instead, it was a Cold War, a term that perfectly encapsulates the tension and hostility that never quite erupted into full-scale war. It was a war of ideologies, propaganda, and proxy conflicts, where battles were fought through words, images, and third-party nations. The two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, stood on opposite sides of a deep ideological divide. Despite their intense rivalry, they never directly engaged in full-scale military combat, a fact that defined the Cold War era. The reason? The terrifying prospect of nuclear annihilation, which loomed over every decision and action taken by both sides. The development and proliferation of nuclear weapons created a new kind of fear, one that was unprecedented in human history. These weapons cast a long shadow over the Cold War, influencing every aspect of the superpowers' strategies and policies. Both superpowers amassed vast arsenals of these devastating weapons, each capable of obliterating the other many times over. This chilling reality created a stalemate, a situation where neither side could risk a direct confrontation without risking total destruction. This chilling reality created a stalemate, a situation known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The very existence of these weapons and the understanding that their use would result in global catastrophe served as a powerful deterrent against direct conflict between the superpowers. This deterrent was a constant reminder of the stakes involved. The understanding that their use would result in global catastrophe kept the superpowers in check. Instead of direct military confrontation, the Cold War played out on multiple fronts: political, economic, and ideological. The Cold War played out on multiple fronts: political, economic, and ideological, with each side trying to outmaneuver the other. The superpowers engaged in a global chess match, vying for influence in every corner of the world. They supported opposing sides in regional conflicts, from Korea to Vietnam to Afghanistan, turning these areas into battlegrounds for their ideologies. They supported opposing sides in regional conflicts, from Korea to Vietnam to Afghanistan. They poured resources into espionage, seeking to undermine each other's governments and gain a strategic advantage. From covert operations to intelligence gathering, espionage became a critical tool in this shadow war. They poured resources into espionage, seeking to undermine each other's governments and gain a strategic advantage, and they waged a relentless propaganda war, each side portraying the other as the embodiment of evil. Propaganda was used to shape public opinion and rally support for their respective causes, each side portraying the other as the embodiment of evil, creating a narrative of us versus them that defined the era. The Cold War was a complex and multifaceted conflict that spanned nearly half a century, from the end of World War II in 1945 to the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. It was a period marked by shifting alliances, ideological battles, and a race for global influence between the United States and the Soviet Union. Periodic crises, such as the Berlin blockade, the Korean War, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, kept the world on edge, with a constant undercurrent of tension. Throughout this era, certain individuals and events left an indelible mark on the course of the Cold War, shaping its trajectory and outcomes. On the American side, President Harry Truman's policy of containment was a cornerstone of U.S. strategy, aimed to limit the spread of Soviet influence and prevent the expansion of communism. John F. Kennedy faced down the Soviets during the Cuban Missile Crisis, a perilous standoff that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. His leadership during this critical moment is often credited with averting a global catastrophe. Ronald Reagan, with his staunch anti-communist stance and his call to tear down the Berlin Wall, played a pivotal role in hastening the collapse of the Soviet Union. His policies and rhetoric significantly contributed to the end of the Cold War. On the Soviet side, Joseph Stalin's brutal dictatorship and expansionist policies fueled Cold War tensions, setting the stage for decades of rivalry. Nikita Khrushchev, though initially attempting a thaw in relations with the West, ultimately presided over the construction of the Berlin Wall, a potent symbol of Cold War division that physically and ideologically separated East and West Berlin. The Berlin Wall stood as a stark reminder of the ideological divide between communism and democracy. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, introduced reforms like glasnost and perestroika, which aimed to open up the Soviet society and economy. These reforms, however, also exposed the weaknesses of the Soviet system. Ultimately, Gorbachev's policies contributed to the dismantling of the Soviet system and the end of the Cold War, leading to a new era in global politics. At its core, the Cold War was a clash between two fundamentally opposed ideologies, democracy and communism. The United States, championing democracy, advocated for individual liberty, free markets, and a government accountable to its people. The Soviet Union, promoting communism, argued for state control of the economy, the suppression of individual freedoms, and the pursuit of a classless society. This ideological conflict permeated every aspect of the Cold War. The United States cast itself as the defender of freedom and democracy, while the Soviet Union presented itself as the champion of the working class and the enemy of capitalist exploitation. Both sides engaged in extensive propaganda campaigns, seeking to win hearts and minds across the globe. The ideological battle also played out in the realm of culture and the arts. The United States promoted its cultural products, music, movies, literature, as expressions of freedom and creativity. The Soviet Union, in turn, sought to control artistic expression within its borders, promoting socialist realism and suppressing dissenting voices. From jazz music to abstract art, the ideological struggle between the superpowers extended even to the realm of cultural expression.